Good afternoon, everybody. Wow, participation, thank you. For being one of the last sessions between here and the party, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it very much. My name is Lisa Jericho, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Technology at Feeding America. And with me, I have Stephanie Zidek, our Senior Analytics Manager. Today, we wanted to talk to you about, give you a little bit of an introduction to Feeding America. Might as well be able to do that pitch. But we'd also like to talk to you about our Tableau journey. And we're very proud of where we are, and we want to talk about how data is helping us solve the problem of hunger in America. And Tableau is a critical partner for us in that journey. And we'll conclude with talking about how we've approached it from a culture perspective. From our vantage point, I think I was kind of peeking at what kind of companies and where many of you came from. Some of you are at Huge Global. I've done Huge Global. This is an interesting opportunity because we have to be, I don't want to use the word smarter, but more analytical about how we spend our resources. And our resources are not only our dollars, but our time. There's not that many behind Stephanie and I supporting this initiative. And so we've really thought through how we create that data-driven culture and build champions throughout our extended organization so that the team gets bigger and stronger as we go. And we want to share some of that with you as well. So a little bit about Feeding America. Our vision is to feed America's hungry through a nationwide network of member food banks and engage our country in the fight to end hunger. Seems simple, right? How many of you have made a joke? Well, it's not like we're trying to solve world hunger. We just kind of limit it to the US. It's hard, but it's actually the thing that keeps us going every day and makes us pleased and proud to come to work. But as we talk about this, we're really working with a huge network. We are the third largest not-for-profit in the US, according to Forbes, and we are the ones focusing on hunger relief in the US. But we don't do it alone as a national office, so anyone who has a corporate kind of mindset, we are a corporate mindset, but we have 200 member food banks. I am not good at naming every food bank in every city, but they are throughout the entire US, and we partner with 60,000 agencies. Think of a food pantry, an agency, soup kitchen. That's how we distribute and help those in need. And it's 46 million people we serve annually. How do we provide meals? We secure food donations. If there's any consumer product companies in the audience, you probably are a donor. We do partner with most in the US, and we're very fortunate for those partnerships. We move the food, we distribute it from the manufacturer, from distributors to the food bank network, and then out to the agencies. We focus on the safety component. We are moving more and more into food rescue. We have wonderful corporate partners there as well with grocery stores and retail outlets that help capture the food that isn't consumed in a safe, reliable way to bring that to those in need. And we focus on continuing to grow that network as we go. The national office is where Stephanie and I work. Often we think we do the strategy work. I've learned over my 2 years at Feeding America, most of that actually is done at the food banks. They are creative, they are brilliant, they are outstanding. But what we're able to do distinctly is really provide that national alignment and that national partnerships. And so that's where we focus. But through that food bank network, we're able to cover every county in the United States. So we're very, very proud of the growth and the efficiency we've had over the last few years. In fiscal year 11, we served 2.8 billion meals. And in FY16, ahead of our planning, we were able to serve 4 billion meals. Huge accomplishment, and yet we still have a major, major food gap in terms of how many people are still in need. And so we always think about how do we do more with the limited resources we have. So as we're thinking through the challenge, as we pivoted off of reaching that 4 billion meal accomplishments, we started having conversations about how many more meals could we source and serve. But we also started to say, how do we reduce the need? And that's been really a critical pivot point for us and a real driver about why Tableau has been such a great partner for us. As our strategy evolves and grows, we need to look at the problem of hunger in new and creative ways. And so we look at it in a more broad sense. We look at it from sourcing, distributing, how we intersect with communities, access more food, influence more food. There'll be a lot of lobbying going on going forward. And for all of these strategies we leverage, we're looking at analytics to help us provide new thoughts on how to approach challenges, new ways to allocate resources, and be very critical in every hour we spend and every dollar we spend in our fight to end hunger. I'm going to now turn it over to Stephanie, and she's going to show you some examples of what we've been doing so far.
So I want to talk about, oh, that's pretty loud. I want to talk about how we have evolved our usage of data over time to kind of get why Tableau has been so meaningful for us. We've been collecting data from our network for 20 years or more, which maybe for folks in the corporate world, it doesn't seem like a long time, but for a nonprofit that's only about 35 or 40 years old, it's actually a pretty great achievement, and we're very proud that we have been collecting data. But how we used to provide it back was basically in one-off requests. So-and-so would call and say, hey, I want to know how many trucks each of your food banks has. And we would say, okay, let us run the data and we'll email it to you. And we might have even sent it to them in a PDF or on a CD, and you can all appreciate those challenges. So we began evolving. We took the next step and we grew up to Excel, and we said, let's make the data. I think I saw a few t-shirts, data to the people, right? That was kind of what we said too. We said, let's give the data to the people. We'll put it in Excel. We'll even provide some nice little summaries of the information, and we'll give them the details too if they want it. It was that they could access it for themselves when they wanted it, when they needed it. Then we said, what else can we do? And we said, let's try to make this data, rather than just a raw data and maybe just a summary level of information, let's develop some comparative reports. And actually our network members really latched onto that idea, and they said, this kind of helps us understand where we are and if we can improve our own performance. And just really understanding, rather than operating in a total silo, how they could further themselves. And data was a component of that for them. So they were starting to see more and more value in the data. But we really felt like, even with providing information in Excel and even some of these comparative reports, that we were really only still reaching the people who were comfortable with Excel, comfortable using their VLOOKUPs to pull data from multiple reports and so on. And we said, really, there's a lot of decision makers out there who should be using data to inform their strategy, inform their action. And if they're not comfortable manipulating this data in Excel with all of their various needs, let's do something more. And that's how we started working with Tableau. We said, we have to make this data visual and accessible to them in a new way to where they can use that information. So as we were going through this as a national office, providing data that was more relevant, more accessible to the people, it became more and more ingrained in the culture, a little baby steps at a time, but still, the data became recognized for what it could do for organizations and how it could help improve performance. Eventually, it was recognized by at least a good number of our members who said, we want to make this a requirement. We want to have a minimum requirement for our organization that all of our food banks will utilize a common performance dashboard to compare themselves to each other and really understand and evaluate their own performance. And they're required to share this with their board of directors at least once a year. And it was put in our contract with them. So now this is a contractually required thing, but it wasn't at Feeding America National Office behest. It wasn't our directive. It was our members that came to us and said, we think this is important, and we think if we put it in a contract that we'll get enough people and this will start to spread. But it really became then this culture shift that not just a few of the leaders in our food banks, in our network, but really now it's all of our members are at least at a minimum utilizing this information to talk about performance and how they can elevate their own performance. So for us, Tableau was really the game changer. We had a lot of requirements. So because it was in the contract, you can imagine no matter how many people are actually in support of it, there's still some folks who might be naysayers or just don't really like being told what to do in that way, which we can all appreciate, I'm sure. So we wanted to make a tool that was really had a lot of capabilities for them, that it was seamless. So we needed them to be able to choose, how could we choose 12 food banks that we want to compare ourselves to? They had the autonomy to choose whoever they wanted. But they said to us, well, can you provide some guidance? We know of a few. We know some people that we're familiar with. But we want to have the flexibility to have some guidance, provide some guidance for us on who we should be selecting. So we had to provide that criteria for them. And then once they make these different selections of peers and they might be changing them, obviously the metrics had to recalculate based on who they were choosing and where did they fall in that sort of spectrum of their peer group. We wanted to show 3-year trends. We wanted to be able to drill down into the metrics a little bit deeper, and obviously having a really user-friendly interface was pretty critical. I confess we had a tool that was maybe the precursor to this that we did in Excel, and the most common question I got was, why isn't it updating when I change the drop-down box? And it's because they weren't enabling the macros. The most common question that I got, and I thought there was so much more to this tool, and that was the question. So Tableau really got us past some of those kinks that we had struggled with in other ways. So this was not going to be a barrier. The tool wasn't going to be the barrier to sharing data and using information. So I want to do a quick demo. And I'll actually... Just a second. So here is kind of our beginning. This was the part where it was the flexibility. What could they, how could we make this work for them and give them the flexibility that they required in order for this to be approved to put in the contract? And so we said, we have what's called, we call it the EPG, or our fruit groups. It's just a convenient way for us to create folks, but they're environmental peer groups, so people who are operating in similar environments. Maybe it's a certain size of their service area, a certain number of people in need, resources available to them. So in many cases, they like to start with that group. So let's choose our blueberries. And you can see as we're changing the filters that our suggested peers are going to update. But the requirement is only that they choose 12, and so this is obviously quite a bit more than 12. And so they have other filters. They could choose to do by region, so maybe they have some interest in geography, which we had some boards of directors say to us that that was more important to them than some of these other criteria. We also wanted to give some of these criteria about operating expenses, the size of their staff, pounds distributed, and their SNAP outreach efforts, SNAP or food stamps. So I often just like to use the pounds distributed. It's a good metric, and you can see that there's a wide range of folks. We go from 14 million pounds to 87 million pounds. So this is a good way to kind of start to narrow down that group. So we simply, Tableau gives us this nice ability, and we start to narrow this down, and we can pull from here. Now, to go further, then some food banks said, well, even though I see this list of food banks, I might still want to pick and choose, like maybe Fort Worth doesn't really make sense for some reason or another because of what I know about them and how their food bank operates differently than ours. So we couldn't just use this list and nicely, plop it over and update the metrics. So they do have to do a little bit of work. I have some already selected just for demo purposes, but I've selected Los Angeles, California. So they select themselves, and then they go down and they use this list to select their group of 12 peers. So I've already pre-selected a number here, and I went with geography for simplicity's sake, but it gives them the option to go through and choose from any of their peers. And then they can go and see the dashboard. So what we wanted was something, again, really clean. But we worked with our member food banks to say, what are the right metrics that you all think are the most important to be a successful food bank? And so we focused them in 4 areas: meeting the need, so this is about our food distribution; stewarding resources, a lot about our fundraising and our efficiency, our efficient use of our financial resources; engaging our community, so for those of you who might be with nonprofits, that's a really important piece to be successful as a nonprofit; and then fostering mission-driven teams, which was actually a really interesting one our folks were so excited about. They said, really, if we want to be successful, we know that we need to have good leaders and kind of what's a measure of good leaders is that our employee engagement and also our board's engagement. So how are we working with them? Now you'll see that our employee engagement and our board engagement metrics right now are blank. This dashboard is just in its first year, and when we first developed this, we didn't have the data yet to be able to complete that. So we have now actually just finished the collection of that data last week. So we'll be putting that into our next iteration and going forward. But we wanted to make sure folks knew that we hadn't lost sight of it. But really what this tells you is that I'm the Los Angeles Food Bank, and I'm the one in blue. So I can easily see in my group of peers where I'm performing. Am I really excellent? So I'm really excellent with my employee retention. That's important to maintaining staff and continuity. So I'm really excellent up here. I have some opportunity to improve in a few other areas. Now I see meals distributed as a % of our meal gap. So the meal gap is the total number of meals that it would take for all of the people living in that area to be food secure or to not be struggling with hunger. In LA County, you can imagine that the need is enormous, so they have a lot of opportunity to continue working, and that's probably not a surprise to them. I think what's really great about this dashboard is a couple of things. One, at first people felt like maybe it was going to be a punitive measure with their board, but we really have found that they're using this to have an open conversation with their board. So even though they might be at the bottom of this list, let's talk about why. It's not just punitive, but what can we do to improve? The other thing is, let's see from our group of peers who's doing really well. The San Francisco Food Bank is doing really well in this particular area. Could we reach out to them and learn what it is that they're doing? What kind of successful programs are they having that's helping them to meet the need? Because San Francisco has a high need too. So it gives them that opportunity to identify who's excelling and who can they reach out to. And on the flip side, they can be a resource to other food banks in terms of some of the areas where they're excelling. So they can be a resource when it comes to employee retention, even in the cost to distribute a meal. In LA County, that's not an insignificant task, and they're still performing at a higher level. We also wanted to provide a few other benchmarks. So we have a couple of these, I think you can see them up there, a few reference lines here. So we have the solid line is the median for the peer group. So there might be some certain circumstances that say, well, our peer group isn't performing as well or is outperforming the network. Our network is the dotted line. But it's an important thing to understand because maybe there are resource constraints or there's a certain size. If we looked at all of the food banks with very large service areas or large need, like LA County, we might see some different results. And it's important to know and then guide that conversation with your board as well to have those reference points. Then we also we said, again, in order to minimize the barriers to adoption, they're sharing this now with their board, and we've been working with them through Tableau Online, which we're thrilled about, and we said this will give you such a seamless thing. You don't even have to have Tableau anything installed on your machine. You just can present this from the web. And they said, yeah, but our board really likes it if we can print it to them and hand it to them while we're sitting there. So we said, okay, we'll give you an opportunity to do that. So they can print this, but that doesn't tell their board who are the high performers and what values they are. So we included kind of blown out tabs for each individual metric. And you can see here at the bottom the name, the areas, the locations where each of those food banks are. And then you can see at the top the values of that. So even when you print this to PDF, and I know we all are here at a Tableau conference, and that's not what we know the power of Tableau to be, but we still had that opportunity to give them that. So again, reducing the barriers to adoption, and we were able to provide that for them. So we do have a couple of others, and we probably just have time for one other demo, but I want to say that the performance benchmarking dashboard was really just the beginning for us. And it started us on this journey of, as I talked about before, importance of data in our organization and throughout our network. But we have a few others that we thought were really important highlights. And we started with one that we call the Retail Opportunity Report. It helps us to identify retail grocery stores are huge partners of ours. They probably provide over a quarter of our total meals that we're helping to distribute. And we said, how can we be more effective in our relationships with them? Where's the opportunity? And the very first version of this report was a few years ago, and it was actually just an Excel file. It was a list. It was a list. Here are the stores. Here's what you're getting from them, and here's what we think you could get from them. And it was really actionable for them because they physically knew where they needed to go. But this, we've changed it, and you can kind of see there's a map, and it shows where, right? It's not just a list of your zip codes and a list of the stores, but it shows where, and it enables our food banks to think more strategically about partnering with agencies, our partner agencies and food pantries that might be in that area, or more efficiently sending out their fleet of trucks to make those pickups and deliveries. And then we have one that it's maybe not a very fancy name here, the current distribution and our meal gap. So for each food bank in the areas that they serve, they can really see very effectively where is the need and where are we currently distributing our food, and are there places where that doesn't align, or are there places where we still see that even though we're doing a lot of work, there's a tremendous amount of need remaining. So I'll actually demo that one in just a second because I like that one. But I think these were two more tools that we provided from the national office to the network. But what's been so powerful is that once people got a taste of this, our food banks said, let me do it. I want to do it. We have our own data, their own ERP data, their own fundraising data, and they said, we can do this too. And so I have just a screenshot of one here, but this is where, when we talk about need at a national level, we talk about it in terms of counties. But when it comes to food banks, they want to know where specifically in their communities is the need. And so they've been working to do this on a more local level. They can plot wherever their agencies are, see which types of agencies have the capacity to do more in those partnerships. So I think that's been the next most exciting thing. The first exciting thing is when you get your hands on Tableau and you're doing all the fun stuff, but then when you get to see that excitement from other people, I think that's where we've had, anyway, I think it's really cool. So I'll do just a quick demo of that meal gap visualization. And so I've started us here with Austin, since we are all in Austin, but each food bank here can simply select themselves from a drop-down box. I will say that at one point in time, we had gotten ourselves into the situation where we were creating one individual report for every food bank. Yes, you can imagine 200 reports at any given time, and you're not really sure if everyone's using those reports. It didn't make a lot of sense. So we fairly quickly realized that that wasn't going to be feasible, and this was more in our Excel days. But we said, this is another way where Tableau gives you a ton of flexibility to say, we don't need to create 200 of these. We can just create one and let them pull the data themselves. So you can see here in this map, the top map shows their current distribution by county. So the green dot here is the food bank. And you can see they have a high amount of distribution in their central region of their service area. But we can look down at the bottom and we can see where is the need still beyond what they're currently distributing. So it's not before their distribution, it's even after what they're currently distributing. So even though Travis, Texas is receiving the most meals right now, we can see that there's still a very significant amount of need in that community. So even though they're doing a ton of work there still remains a lot to be done. But it's interesting, you can see here that they're doing a pretty good job in McLennan, Texas. They're doing a lot of distribution, and you can see that relative need, now there's still need, but it's a little bit lower in terms of volume. And then they've actually done terrific work in Mills, Texas, or perhaps the need is just a little bit lower, but they've already met the need there, in theory. Doesn't mean they can stop distributing, it just means they may not have to focus there anymore or as much. And then you can see here, we want to give just that relative picture. So I think the colored map tells you kind of where, and it gets you start thinking about location and strategies. But this really gets to the volume. So the red bar, again, is the remaining need, and you can see how big this remaining need really is in Travis, Texas, and how much it kind of dwarfs even the others. Not that 7.5 million meals of remaining need in Williamson, Texas is insignificant, but you can see how big those differences really are. And then, we have a little bit of other information, and just for for kicks, we show, I forgot to change that back after we were goofing around. I think I can just change it to fit with. There we go. But you can see the trends over time. So it's a little bit harder to see on this screen, but these are the different quarters and across time. So for a number of years, you can see. And then we have our donated food, our USDA food, and our purchased food. And this becomes important because the different sources of food, as they fluctuate over time, it's not exactly like we have control over how much food we're getting from any given source. It's all donated, or in some cases it comes from the federal government. So these are big challenges that food banks have to deal with. And if they're trending down in a certain area, we've seen some food banks where they're, the USDA commodities that they're receiving were dropping off pretty significantly over time. And they said, we're going to have to make up for that in some other area. So this was a good way for them to kind of see that. But I think that's it. I'm going to turn it back over to Lisa to talk more about our future.
So this is, excuse me, every time I see what Stephanie and the team does, I kind of ooh and ah and wow over it, and it's what I do every day. But this is also the part where I tell the truth. They're miracle workers with a server under her boss's desk. Okay? When I got to the organization 2 years ago, let's just say we have a lot of opportunity on the IT front to make improvements. And so what that said to us, though, is in my past world, in the corporate life, we started a huge enterprise data warehouse project with more money than I could ever fathom spending in this context. It's not that I couldn't get it, it just would be wrong because of what I should be spending the money on, which is feeding people. So we had to be really thoughtful and very mindful about how we approach the problem and not let various barriers, like the absence of a data warehouse, stop us from making progress. And so with help of many, we really sat down and said, where are we today? What is our vision of where we want to be? Strategically, is it aligned with the mission of the organization and the priorities of our organizations? And how do we map all of that together to build an adoption strategy that was very mindful and realistic about where we were in our journey with data and analytics, but also leverage the power and excitement of our Tableau relationship? So we looked at it, and fundamentally, again, this is not insignificant. The food banks are all independent 501c3s. It is like not even partnering with subsidiaries in a corporation, it's partnering with people who are an entirely different company. Yet, we have alignment on the goals and the mission, and we have alignment on resources, and we need to work together to be effective. So it's not as disjointed as it seems until occasionally we hit some barriers. So we had to be really thoughtful about their perspective in the universe. They're all in different places on their capability and their journeys. They have different levels of trust in us as the national office. Many of them existed before the national office did. And so we're all in different places on that journey. So we really looked at it from three key areas. We talked about the technology. This was the easiest decision. We're here with Tableau. But there were other facets to that that we delved into. We wanted to talk about data availability. Again, remind you, we don't have a data warehouse yet. I'm having a little anxiety about that this week, but on most days, that's a reality that it just is, and it won't be that way forever, but we can't stop the journey waiting for perfection. And we talk about engagement, and that's critical because not only are we trying to drive engagement at the national office, there's executive sponsorship in me, but not every one of my peers on the executive level understand how to use data and reporting and analytics. So we have to do that and engage our own national office, and of course engagement on the 200 food banks. And so we looked at it in a very methodical method, and we always think about it in terms of a journey. We know we had our 1 year anniversary of our receiving the Tableau grant last week. So we really are only at the infancy of this long journey that we're on. So we're excited by that. But we think about this as a progression, and all of these things are kind of in motion at once. So first, on the technology front, we were really methodical on how to set up Tableau Online. And there are many people on the Tableau team who helped us think about the pros and cons on this. Security, administration, management, all kinds of things. But when it came down to it, the critical requirement for us was we needed both public and private spaces for people to work. We knew that the trust level wasn't uniform across the food banks, and that especially on donor data, it's very emotional and very, very near and dear to their heart. They wouldn't want to share that with us, and yet we didn't want to slow down progress about using the tool for them to improve. But we also knew we had to think about project sites for everyone, because we really do believe in and advocate the sharing of data and sharing of analytics and sharing our workbooks and our outcomes. And so we're trying to live in both worlds, and we know that at times that doesn't fit because they are kind of diametrically opposed, and yet we are trying to meet the community, meet our organization where we are today, and help build incentives to move everybody into a more sharing world. So I was excited when I saw the collaboration capability, because that's going to be huge for us. The templates are going to be huge for us. So there's a lot of things Tableau is doing that will help us move from the private into more shared. And we also think about sandboxes. We are so very, very excited and proud of our Data Fellow program. That's how we're building more Stephanies, basically, because she can't do it alone, and I'm not good at it as she is. But fundamentally, we know they also need a space to work as they're learning and growing their skills. And I'll talk more about that. On the data availability, again, confession, there is no data warehouse. But that doesn't mean we don't have data. It just means we have to be more creative in how we deliver it and how we share it. And I think in conversations with a lot of people, and I definitely confronted this in my past global corporate world, I'm probably not the norm on the IT front, where like I have always believed in democratization of data, and so our thought is share, source. But what I am very much an advocate for is efficiency, productivity, and so part of our thinking around building this data structure over time is if we're all using census data, which we are, don't have 200 food banks go deal with that. Let's figure out how to do that holistically for the organization. The data sources that Stephanie has, they are under in a server under a desk. We got to be more careful with that, because that's really our gold. But we'll do that. That'll be higher on our priority list to make sure that that's repeatable. It doesn't update daily, therefore it's totally safe right now, so we're not panicking about anything. We've got transactional data for our national office. It'll come from our ERP solution. It'll come from our CRM solution. Those will all be part of this. But we're really working to think through the online shared library and then driving to data integration. This used to be further down in my roadmap, and then I realized and remembered how complicated this part will be. That data that Stephanie just showed you, a large part of that comes, I call it a survey. It's not Survey Monkey. Stephanie, you're totally right. It's a self-built application, but it is data collected by people keying in data. So as a data purist, that makes me a little bit uncomfortable, because, innocent people key stuff in wrong. So we also know that to really accelerate the journey, we're going to have to get more data from the network and more current data. We do some data collection monthly, we do some quarterly, we do some annually. I could do some weekly, and once I have it working for weekly, I could even do nightly. There's no real-time need, but we can accelerate moving the data, but this process, knowing where all the food banks are, will be complicated. So we're starting that strategy work in about 3 to 4 weeks. And we're going to try and figure out how to do this in the most efficient way. I've done it in a corporate world with heavy resource, and it's still hard. So we've got to be smarter about this. Ultimately, I literally was talking to Neil just yesterday about how do I accelerate data warehousing? So with everything Tableau's coming out with, do I need a traditional data warehouse? Maybe not. We're going to talk about that. We're going to get more help from people who are going to help us think this through. The national office in particular is accelerating our technology to everything cloud. We are moving quick. There was a general underinvestment in technology. So therefore, I have this remarkable ability, which in the corporate world would have been impossible, to go to cloud and to go quickly. And so now the question is, well, if I'm doing that with my ERP, my CRM, mail, SharePoint, and the list goes on, how do I do it here? And what do I do to make it more effective and efficient? And then, of course, data partnerships. How do we get more data that everybody needs for the productivity? It's at the end only because it's not the hardest thing I'm trying to figure out, but we will be figuring it out as a team. So engagement. This part is critical, and this is how we really are thinking about everything we do. We're making sure our engagement strategy leads the technology. And as an IT professional, that's a disciplined approach that I have to remember to not get excited by the technology, because it's awesome. We focus on education and outreach. We talk about user communities, and again, back to the data fellows. To us, this is the key to unlocking all of our future successes. It's acknowledging that in some worlds you can have champions that are already there. In our world, we're taking people with high aptitude and a high desire, and we're turning them into champions by educating and training and partnering with them. And then they continue to keep this circle moving for us and with us. They start, instead of Stephanie doing all the presentations for user communities, the data fellows start doing it. They start doing education and training. They become our Tableau doctors. We are not afraid to take every great idea Tableau has ever generated. We will have Tableau doctors in our food bank network. We're trying to come at this from every angle to meet people where they are and help move them through their education and learning and journey to become more capable partners for it. And so we realize that we're accepting where we are. We know and have a clear vision of where we want to be, but we need to take people with us, and this is how we're doing that as we go forward. And so as anybody in not-for-profit, and really just anybody in the universe, should end everything with big thank yous. None of this would be possible without the Tableau Foundation. We are so very fortunate to have that wonderful partnership, and that partnership goes so very deep that I know that any question, any roadblock, any challenge, the foundation helps us find amazing resources who are largely in the front row, who can provide expertise to help unstuck us and keep us moving forward. And so we say thank you, because this wouldn't be possible without that. We are just very lucky and very fortunate, but very excited by the potential. We know that with the use of Tableau and our analytics strategy, we will be able to accelerate our journey and feed more people. And so I want to thank you all for joining. Thank you for coming. And we'll open up for questions.
And I think we're supposed to remind you to complete the,
Oh, yeah. I forgot that part.
the evaluation. And our contact information if you haven't. Any questions? That's a great question. So the question was, for the recording, I think, and for the benefit of the room, our food banks are creating their own dashboards, and are we letting them connect directly to our data? So in some cases, yes. We have some data that we're providing for them, and that's a little bit more of the strategy that Lisa was talking about, that we want to provide more for them. So we're providing the data that we're collecting from them so they get it for the national view. And then we're providing other resources that we know that are widely used, data sources that they can connect to. But they're also connecting to a lot of their own data sources, because they have a lot of operational data and the donor data that was mentioned before that they're connecting to as well. So it's a little bit of both, I guess. Does that answer your question?
I'm wondering about the licensing, how that's set up. What kind of licenses do they have? What kind of software do they have in order for them to be effective?
Yeah.
We have a contained number of desktop licenses, and we have a larger number of online licenses. And so we administer and manage the licenses centrally. We keep track of them. It's definitely, I think, on our list of things that we have to keep an eye on. It's making sure the licenses are being used and taken back and things like that. But yes, it's one Tableau online environment with a combination of desktop and online licenses. And so our goal is, again, keep everybody centrally connected and manage through that holistically. Is there any more questions? There was.
Are there any metrics associated, so I happen to be from Austin, and I was noticing, I would imagine over time that red bar was getting bigger because this city is growing like crazy, and Travis County is the county we're in right now, right? So it's metropolitan. But one thing I was also curious about was, are there any metrics associated with how far away someone has to get to a food bank? Because I didn't see it on your stuff, but some of those counties that you referenced in the top, they're pretty rural, and so it might even be possible that they could be served in Austin, but it's not really feasible because it's so far.
So our food banks have a number of strategies, and I can't speak specifically to exactly how our Austin food bank is executing here, but typically our food banks have worked through partner agencies, so those food pantries and stuff. And so more and more food banks are making sure that their partners are in the right locations to meet the need. So if I had to guess, I would say that there are a very large number of partner agencies here in Travis County. For some of those other more rural areas, if there aren't partner agencies, a lot of our food banks operate what's called mobile pantries. So they'll bring out a truck of food and they'll set up sometimes just in a parking lot at an agreed upon time, and they've kind of marketed it to the community through a variety of different methods. And then people who are in need know to come at a particular day and time. And so that's how they can meet that need. And even in a rural county, if there is an agency, if that county is large, right, maybe somebody from the other side can't make it to that agency. So then that's why a lot of mobile markets have been set up to kind of fill in the gap where they don't have partner agencies.
As we progress in some other initiatives, we're collecting more and more data about the clients we serve. Mm-hmm. And by that, we're able to map more of where they are served, how many different agencies it takes to serve them, and understand more about the demographics of how they travel. So they may live in a rural area, but they travel into work in an urban. And so do the hours of that food bank, food source, are they open long enough to get that transition times and things like that? So over time, I know that's part of the reason it was so important to get the tool in the hands of the food banks, because they've got the next level depth of data about the clients we're serving and are asking those questions. I know there's been decisions that have said, okay, agency partner who has a pantry, you're not open the right hours. The clients have need here. Can we shift your day, not extend necessarily, but to hit more strategically? And that's been some of the actionable insights that the process has been able to unlock for us.
Thank you, first of all, really great. So at the beginning, you showed the slide about one of the major goals is to increase the number of served, and the other one is to decrease what they need. And I'm sorry if I missed it.
No,
Detail dashboard, I'm wondering how you're measuring the decrease.
So we're using as our primary benchmark is the USDA measurement of food insecurity. So the challenge is, right, so that's where we start, and then through that food insecurity survey that the USDA puts out, there's a series of questions that say how many dollars would you need to be able to provide all your own meals. And so we can make some estimations, and we have a research team that has a fairly thorough methodology for determining how many meals does that kind of build up to. So that's kind of what we're working towards. But we know, right, that there's a lot of things with the economy changing that are completely 100% out of our control that are going to affect that. So we saw a huge spike during the 08, 09, 2010 recession, and we didn't really see a drop off for a long time, even though the economy recovered, was no longer in recession. The people in need really are seeing that last, and many of them still aren't seeing that. But it did start to drop in a couple of cases, and people said, what does that mean for us? But I think it's still an important story to talk about, because it is how is the need changing over time? And we're really using, I guess, the long-winded answer to your question, but about food insecurity, and it is a USDA administered survey.
I've heard that there's about 3 or 4 or 5 standard ERP systems that all food banks use.
Two, two primary, and then some dogs and cats along in that process, yeah.
And some various versions of
And,
the
yeah.
two primary.
Yes.
Are there any plans to do like a basic strategy on how you get at the data?
Yes. So once upon a time, our technology strategy was to try and convince everybody to use the same tool, and yeah, that doesn't work very well. So now we are focused on absolutely trying to look at data strategies. We already, even for what Stephanie showed us to show a lot of the data we do for the NAR, for the annual reporting, comes out of predefined reporting out of the solutions. And then the next iteration is how to automate that in a more of a API mindset. So we have a really close partnership with one of the solution series, and I'm already working on building the partnership with the other so that we can start that data strategy about moving data in a more real-time way. So absolutely.
And the first dashboard that you showed, that's for top. How did you land on the metrics that are displayed there? Was it general consensus? Did you get buy-in?
Yeah, great question.
The question was the performance benchmark dashboard. How do we figure out what we actually were going to measure?
So it was truthfully a year-long process. We knew it would be a lengthy process because we knew it was going to be put into the contract, and the contract has to be voted on and approved by the members. So we wanted to make sure we did a thorough process. But we had a committee of 15 representatives from our food banks and people from all different areas, operations, finance, CEOs, et cetera. And I mean, we sat around table for a few days at different points through the year and just hashed out all of the different possible things we could measure. And then we even sat around hashing out the actual calculation. So not just like what did we want to measure, but how exactly were we going to calculate it. So there was a lot of discussion, but it was really important. I'd say two things. One is that the food banks were involved in determining it because it's their business, right? I mean, that's what they think is important. But the other piece is along the way, so even though there were only 15 food banks of our 200 that were involved in that process, we had very regular communications with the network to say, how we were progressing and kind of what was on the table and did they have any feedback. So there were actually a couple of things that we incorporated later that was as a result of some feedback that we had gotten from some of our webinar series and other sort of communication channels.
A key point that I don't know that we said, in general, the culture of the food banks, if you ask 5 food banks their opinion, you'll get 8 opinions. Normal. And on that dashboard, we had a 98% approval rating. So it was very much a thoughtful change management process, coupled with the presentation that made it easy to use. And the combination just made that a very easy sell in the end. But it was hours and hours of effort to get the alignment there. And I think all analytics can possibly go through that process. What we're looking at now for the national office, because we don't have clarity on all of our measures yet, using more of an iterative approach because we can and we have the tools, and say, all right, let's look at that and see how it goes, but still working on getting the buy-in the whole way. Any more questions? Lee?
So you touched on the idea about one of the insights that you found. Do you have any more stories to share about the insights that came out and what actions you were able to take?
The question was, were there any more kind of concrete examples of actions that our food banks were taking? And I think, truthfully, I showed the Austin distribution one, and that's where they actually changed their distribution, so that was kind of cool. I don't have names of food banks because I've forgotten them, which ones told me which stories, but definitely food banks have found that they were surprising with that whole concept on the performance benchmarking. It's kind of a general, but they've said, we were surprised to see where we fell in this particular area, and we had to do a different evaluation with our board of directors to say, if we're not performing as well as we thought we were, should this be an area of emphasis for us? So a couple of those things were in the fundraising area, which is critical, but also in the efficiency of the fundraising. So there are costs to raise $1, and it's but because of this, I think we've had a number of food banks we're kind of working with in partnership with a group at the national office we're calling it Network Fundraising Services, but we're trying to provide programmatic guidance of how food banks can improve their overall fundraising program. And that has really led some of them to seek maybe more direct support from us, but also even reaching out to some peers that they probably thought they were better than. And maybe, I mean, I don't mean that in a negative way, but they were kind of surprised to learn who they were. There's an interesting story from a few years ago. We had a member who I think thought in terms of kind of overall performance, combination of distribution of food and fundraising and their community engagement, thought they were like an exceptional performer. They thought they were in the top quarter of our network in terms of performance. And at one point, they looked at some of the data, and it wasn't this particular dashboard, but it was something else, and they said they were actually in just under the bottom half. But it was because they hadn't seen the data before. They just thought because of who they knew and kind of who was around them. And so that's where this tool takes that and gives it to everybody. So, I don't know.
And then,
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
and then should we dig a little bit more? I'm sure there's some not horror stories, but to what extent do they actually trust the data, given that they don't understand necessarily the data sources underlying? And I'm sure there's been some conversation around that.
Great question. So the question was around how much do people trust the data sources if they don't see or understand it? And part of it, there's kind of two answers to that. Part of it is that it's the data that they've provided to us. So if their own food bank's data doesn't look right, we can say to them it's because it's what you reported to us. What we haven't talked about yet, but this has been, when I showed that, that arrow of the journey, our data journey over time, the more we've made the data accessible and relevant to the food banks, the more they care about what they're reporting to us. So we've seen a huge improvement in the accuracy of what we've been seeing. It's not to say it's perfect and there's still some ways to go. I think there was a little bit of, well, I can control my own data, what I'm submitting, but I don't know if so-and-so is really submitting accurate data. I'm looking at their results and that makes no sense to me. They couldn't possibly be right. There are always going to be outliers, and you'll have to just take those with a grain of salt. But I think in totality, the food banks have been really supportive of this. And because they see the data and they know it's being used, they're paying more attention. So I think that's probably the moral of the story that I would share.
I think the other side of it too is, I mean, in any data strategy, showing the data actually makes people care about the quality of the data, using the data. In our case, we also talk about our implementation and our usage and our use cases and our engagement in every context we can when we're together with the food banks. So we have a series of conferences. That's part of our user community. I know every time I'm on the phone with a food bank, somehow, no matter where we start the conversation, we end with something about Tableau. And so it's also become very much a source of energy and excitement in the network about having the tool, having access to it. And so that also further propels them to understand and think about data. And so sometimes you don't want the technology to lead, but in this case, it's been a huge value. Are there any more questions?
Have a question? Or?
I had a question about how you calculate the cost to raise dollars. Just, I work with social services, and one of the things we struggle with is what cost are you competing with? Is it maybe overhead costs? Is it staff? I mean, what do you?
Yeah, the question was how do we calculate the cost to raise $1? Great question, and not something that we resolved very quickly. So when I said we hashed around how should this be calculated, that was one of the ones that was went round and round with a lot of different ideas and struggles. What we ultimately landed with, and part of this was for consistency, because every food bank has, and every organization has a different chart of accounts, right, general ledger. And so that makes it really hard to know that you're accounting direct mail in the same way that you're accounting direct mail and personal solicitation and online giving and so on, right? But what we really use is essentially what they're submitting in their 990 as the development expenses. So there's the program, the development, and then the management. And so we use the development expense line item and then compare that to, they do submit to us how much fundraising they're doing. I will say, just as a really nitty-gritty detail, we talk about fundraising for operations. We don't include capital campaign fundraising because that's a huge difference.
Very different.
So,
are there any more questions? We want to thank you again for joining us today and listening to our story. Thank you very much for being here.